The study of strategy begins with understanding how people make decisions when the outcome depends not only on their own actions, but also on the actions of others. Game theory emerged from this question. It is not a theory about games, but a framework for analyzing strategic behavior wherever human interaction involves risk, reward, and anticipation. From its mathematical foundations in the mid-20th century, game theory became one of the most influential tools for shaping modern management and entrepreneurship. At its core, game theory assumes that individuals act rationally, that they seek to maximize their own payoffs given the circumstances they face. Every game has three elements: players, moves, and payoffs. Each player chooses from a set of possible actions, knowing that the result depends on what others choose to do. The simplest examples, two firms setting prices, two negotiators deciding whether to cooperate or defect, can reveal fundamental truths about human strategy. But the elegance of the theory lies in how it scales. It applies as much to markets and organizations as it does to single decisions. Early economists recognized that business competition was itself a form of structured play. Every price change, every marketing campaign, every hiring decision was a move in an ongoing game. John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern's theory of games and economic behavior provided the foundation, but it was John Nash who introduced the equilibrium concept that made the theory practical. A Nash equilibrium describes a state in which each player has chosen a strategy that is optimal given the strategies of others. No one has anything to gain by changing their own move unilaterally. It is a fragile but powerful idea, one that explains why even self-interested people often settle into predictable patterns of cooperation. As the field matured, it moved beyond abstract mathematics. Corporations began applying it to real decisions. During the Cold War, strategists at RAND Corporation used game theory to analyze nuclear deterrence and foreign policy. The same reasoning filtered into corporate boardrooms in the 1960s and 1970s. Shell used game theoretic modeling to anticipate oil price movements. IBM applied similar methods to competitive product launches. By the time the first business schools introduced formal game theory courses, the framework had become a language for thinking strategically about complex organizations. Yet, as James D. Miller wrote in Game Theory at Work, the world of game theory can be an unforgiving place. It assumes no compassion, no altruism, only self-interest. Within this logic, an employer gives a raise not out of kindness, but because it serves their own long-term interest in retaining talent. A company cooperates with a rival because cooperation maximizes profit, not because it feels ethically right. In this sense, game theory mirrors the logic of capitalism itself, a system in which competition, when properly structured, can still yield cooperative outcomes. Understanding this tension between self-interest and cooperation is critical for leaders. The same reasoning that allows a company to outmaneuver competitors can also reveal how loyalty, trust, and fairness emerge as rational strategies. Cooperation is not the opposite of competition. It is a solution that sometimes arises when all parties recognize that conflict would leave them worse off. Even ruthless competitors have incentives to collaborate when mutual destruction is the alternative. Consider a simple scenario. Two companies operate in the same market. Each can choose to cut prices or maintain them. If both maintain prices, profits remain healthy. If one cuts prices while the other holds, the first gains market share at the expense of the second. But if both cut prices, both suffer losses. This is a form of the prisoner's dilemma, a structure that appears repeatedly in markets, politics, and workplaces. The rational pursuit of self-interest can lead to a collectively irrational outcome. To avoid it, companies develop trust, regulations, or long-term relationships that change the incentives of the game. Miller described how credibility rather than power often determines success. Threats and promises only work if they are believable. A manager who threatens to fire an employee but has no intention of following through has no leverage. Similarly, a company that threatens a price war it cannot sustain weakens its future negotiating position. The key lesson is that credibility is itself a form of capital. Once lost, it cannot be easily regained. The importance of credible commitment extends beyond business negotiations. It defines how leaders manage expectations within teams. When a leader makes a promise to recognize good work or provide clear advancement opportunities, they enter a repeated game with their employees. Every decision becomes a signal about how seriously their commitments are taken. Over time, these signals shape the culture of the organization. A leader who repeatedly changes direction or rescinds agreements trains people to stop believing them. The result is disengagement and cynicism, not because people are emotional, but because they are rational players responding to unreliable incentives. In the same way, employees respond strategically to systems of rewards and punishment. When performance metrics are vague or inconsistent, people adjust by optimizing for appearances rather than outcomes. Game theory reminds us that every rule, every policy, every incentive system is itself a game structure. People learn the rules faster than most managers expect. They adapt to maximize their personal payoff within the system as designed, not necessarily in the way leadership intends. When organizations misunderstand this, they often mistake compliance for engagement. Employees play to win the metrics, not to fulfill the mission. The disciplined use of game theory, therefore, demands more than cleverness. It requires ethical awareness. A strategist who manipulates others without understanding the long-term costs of lost trust will win in the short term and destroy value in the long term. The challenge for responsible leadership is not to outsmart others, but to design environments where honesty and cooperation are the rational choices. Miller offered an instructive example through the story of Cortés burning his ships upon arrival in Mexico. By destroying the means of retreat, he made his intentions credible. He and his army would fight to the end. In business, the same principle applies when a leader eliminates options to demonstrate commitment. A company that publicly announces a bold move, a new product line, a sustainability pledge, a policy to reduce exploitation, gains credibility precisely because retreat would be costly. Yet this tactic must be used carefully. Eliminating options can focus effort, but it also removes flexibility. In responsible management, credibility should emerge from integrity, not from self-imposed traps. The broader lesson is that leadership operates in sequential games rather than single moves. Decisions unfold over time, and each move influences the next. Sequential thinking allows leaders to anticipate not only immediate outcomes, but also how others will respond in future rounds. In the example of a raise negotiation, a boss who refuses a reasonable request today may save money in the short run, but increase turnover costs later. Game theory translates such trade-offs into a language of payoffs and probabilities, but the underlying wisdom is timeless. Every decision is part of an ongoing relationship. The next development in applying these ideas to management came when economists began to integrate psychology into the models. Real people, unlike the theoretical players of early game theory, are not perfectly rational. They have bounded rationality, emotions, and biases. Behavioral economics showed that fairness, trust, and reciprocity often influence decisions as much as monetary payoffs. This insight opened the door for a more human application of game theory in organizations. It suggested that cooperation could arise not only from strict self-interest, but also from social norms that evolve within repeated interactions. For example, in team settings, people often contribute to group goals even when individual rewards are uncertain. They do so because they value reputation, belonging, and moral satisfaction. These non-monetary payoffs are real and measurable. When leaders understand them, they can design systems that align ethical behavior with rational incentives. In this way, game theory becomes not a tool for manipulation, but a framework for understanding motivation. Many early corporate strategists misused game theory by treating it as a formula for dominance. They imagined the ideal executive as a chess master, always anticipating competitors' moves and exploiting weaknesses. This interpretation ignored the cooperative dimension that John Nash himself emphasized. Equilibrium, in its true sense, is not about victory, but about stability. It describes a state in which all players have found strategies that make sense relative to one another. In human terms, it means a balance of interests where mutual benefit is sustainable. A company that squeezes every possible advantage from its suppliers, customers, or employees may win a battle but lose the long game of equilibrium. Ethical leadership in this framework involves designing games that others want to keep playing. A sustainable organization ensures that every stakeholder, employees, customers, partners, and even competitors, finds ongoing value in participation. This does not mean avoiding competition. It means structuring it so that cooperation remains rational. In markets, regulation often plays this role by setting boundaries that prevent destructive spirals. Inside companies, culture performs the same function. Clear norms, transparency, and consistent follow-through act as stabilizers. They ensure that trust becomes the equilibrium state rather than deception. As game theory entered the business mainstream, it also influenced how entrepreneurs thought about opportunity. The startup world became a living laboratory for strategic interaction. Founders faced simultaneous games with investors, employees, and customers, each with different payoffs and information. Credibility again proved decisive. A founder promising innovation and social impact who later pivots to exploitative practices erodes trust across all relationships. In contrast, a founder who demonstrates consistent principles can attract collaborators even without immediate monetary incentives. The logic is straightforward. In environments of uncertainty, people gravitate toward players whose moves are predictable and aligned with shared goals. This connection between predictability and leadership integrity has profound implications. It suggests that honesty is not merely a moral virtue, but a strategic advantage. In repeated games, trustworthiness reduces transaction costs and increases cooperation. An organization that keeps its word spends less energy enforcing contracts and managing conflict. It also becomes more adaptable because its members can coordinate quickly without second-guessing motives. Game theory provides the intellectual justification for this practical wisdom. When others know that you act consistently with stated principles, they can plan around you confidently. Stability becomes a source of power. But game theory also exposes the danger of vague commitments. When promises are not backed by clear incentives or measurable actions, they create uncertainty. In social systems, this uncertainty breeds resentment. People feel misled, not because outcomes are unfavorable, but because expectations were unclear. Leaders who frequently change course or reinterpret commitments teach others that cooperation is risky. Over time, this leads to defensive behavior, hoarding information, withholding effort, or disengaging emotionally. The system becomes less efficient, not because people are irrational, but because they have learned rational caution in response to unreliable leadership. The responsible application of game theory in management therefore begins with self-awareness. Every policy, every incentive, every promise sets the rules of a game. Leaders must understand not only their intended effects, but also the strategic adaptations they invite. For instance, performance-based bonuses may motivate high output, but can also encourage competition that undermines collaboration. A zero-tolerance policy may deter misconduct, but discourage open communication about mistakes. Each rule changes the payoff matrix, sometimes in ways that contradict the organization's values. Responsible leaders test these dynamics before they unfold, using the logic of game theory to foresee unintended consequences. In practice, this means asking a series of disciplined questions. What are the incentives we are creating? How will rational players respond? What patterns will emerge over time? Do these patterns align with our ethical and strategic goals? Such questioning turns abstract theory into practical foresight. It also redefines leadership as the design of systems rather than the exercise of authority. A good leader doesn't merely play the game well. They construct the game itself in a way that promotes fairness, trust, and collective progress. The history of management shows how easily this perspective can be lost. When companies reduce decision-making to competition alone, they eventually face internal instability. Price wars, talent poaching, and destructive internal politics are all symptoms of zero-sum thinking. In contrast, organizations that balance competition with credible cooperation, clear rules, mutual benefit, shared purpose, achieve resilience. They can adapt to changing environments because their members trust the underlying system even when circumstances shift. This understanding also reshapes how we think about entrepreneurship. The entrepreneur's challenge is not only to innovate, but to orchestrate a network of stakeholders with different incentives: investors seeking returns, employees seeking stability, customers seeking value, and regulators seeking compliance. Each interaction is a game, but these games overlap. A responsible entrepreneur recognizes the interdependence of these systems and designs strategies that maintain trust across all of them. Short-term opportunism may yield initial growth, but only integrity sustains it. In this first exploration, the purpose has not been to moralize, but to demonstrate that ethical behavior and strategic reasoning are not opposing forces. They are two sides of the same discipline. Game theory, stripped of its mathematical complexity, offers a clear insight. In any system of repeated interaction, cooperation built on credibility outperforms manipulation built on deceit. The rational actor, when truly informed, chooses integrity not out of virtue alone, but because it creates durable advantage. This realization forms the foundation for applying game theory responsibly in modern management and entrepreneurship. The next step is to explore how these principles shape the psychology of innovation, how founders, leaders, and teams translate strategic logic into culture, and how the same reasoning that can be used to dominate can also be used to empower. Entrepreneurship exists at the intersection of uncertainty and incentive. It is a domain where theory meets psychology, where the clean logic of payoffs and equilibria encounters human ambition, fear, and creativity. The entrepreneur is not merely a participant in the market game, but also its designer. They choose which games to play, how to define the rewards, and how to attract others to join. Game theory helps illuminate the structure behind these choices. Each startup begins as a network of relationships: founders, investors, employees, and early adopters, each with different information and motives. The founder's role is to align these motives through credible signals and consistent behavior. In this sense, the entrepreneurial journey is an exercise in sequential play. Every decision influences what comes next. Every promise sets expectations that will later be tested. In his work, Employee to Entrepreneur, Steve Glaveski described how the transition from employment to entrepreneurship exposes the mechanics of incentive. As an employee, one plays a relatively stable game with fixed rules. Payoffs are predictable, authority is clearly distributed, and information is controlled by hierarchy. The move to entrepreneurship removes that structure. Suddenly, every assumption must be tested, and credibility becomes the only real currency. The entrepreneur's success depends on convincing others, investors, partners, customers, to act on incomplete information. This is the purest application of game theory in real life. The startup is an iterative experiment in belief formation. Each prototype, each promise, and each act of transparency is a move designed to influence the beliefs of others. A founder who communicates with clarity and follows through on commitments gradually creates a reputation that functions as a self-reinforcing advantage. Those who overpromise and retreat erode the very trust that makes cooperation possible. The lean startup method that Glaveski advocates formalizes this process. It treats entrepreneurship as a series of experiments designed to reduce uncertainty. Each test, from customer interviews to product launches, is a strategic round in a repeated game. The entrepreneur forms a hypothesis about the market's response, plays a move, observes the outcome, and adjusts. This approach rewards adaptability, but it also demands integrity. Data can be misinterpreted, signals can be cherry-picked, and narratives can be shaped to attract investment even when evidence is weak. A responsible founder resists that temptation. They understand that short-term misrepresentation undermines long-term credibility, turning what should be an iterative learning process into a sequence of mistrust. The psychology of entrepreneurship, therefore, cannot be separated from the ethics of information. Every startup operates under asymmetric knowledge. Founders know things investors do not, investors know things founders do not, and customers know their own needs better than either. Game theory predicts that such asymmetries create adverse selection, situations where those with better information exploit those with less. In markets, this leads to inefficiency. In startups, it leads to disillusionment. Responsible founders counteract this by practicing radical transparency. They disclose risks, limitations, and uncertainties not as weaknesses, but as signals of reliability. In doing so, they redefine the equilibrium of trust. Inside the startup, incentive design becomes the central task. Traditional management relies on authority. Entrepreneurial management relies on alignment. A team of skilled people, each with their own ambitions, must choose to coordinate rather than pursue self-interest. This coordination cannot be enforced through hierarchy alone. It requires shared purpose and credible reward structures. Equity, autonomy, and learning opportunities become the new payoffs. When structured carefully, they create a cooperative game where individual success reinforces collective success. Miller's insights into managing employees through game-theoretic reasoning apply directly here. He noted that people act according to the incentives they perceive, not the values leaders claim to hold. A promise of future reward means little if the leader's behavior suggests inconsistency. Employees will discount promises that are not backed by clear, observable commitment. In startups, this discounting can happen quickly. A missed payment, a broken timeline, a sudden change in direction. Each signals instability. Once that perception takes hold, cooperation deteriorates. The responsible entrepreneur understands this dynamic and builds credibility through small, repeated demonstrations of reliability. They pay when they say they will, share information openly, and admit uncertainty before others discover it. This approach is not about moral virtue, but about maintaining equilibrium within the organization. When people can predict how their leader will respond, coordination improves, and the company can absorb shocks without internal collapse. Game theory also helps explain why some founders unintentionally breed dysfunction. When goals are ambiguous or incentives misaligned, employees revert to individual optimization. They seek to protect themselves, accumulate private information, or compete for recognition. These behaviors are not signs of poor character. They are rational responses to poorly designed systems. A culture of blame, for example, creates a coordination failure where people hide problems to avoid punishment. A transparent culture, by contrast, encourages early disclosure, allowing the group to solve issues collectively. The difference lies not in personality, but in the design of the game. Glaveski's emphasis on experimentation aligns with this reasoning. He described how productive entrepreneurs replace perfectionism with iterative learning. They act, measure, and adapt. From a game-theoretic perspective, this is equivalent to playing repeated games with feedback. Each iteration builds knowledge that changes future payoffs. The key is to maintain integrity across rounds, to ensure that every iteration strengthens rather than weakens trust. The temptation to manipulate outcomes or exaggerate progress is strong, especially when investors demand constant growth. But the rational long-term strategy is honesty. Repeated games reward those who value reputation over immediate gain. In this sense, entrepreneurship becomes a moral exercise in sustained credibility. It demands the discipline to maintain honesty, even when deception could yield short-term advantage. Game theory clarifies why this discipline is rational. In repeated interactions, the value of reputation compounds. Once lost, it cannot be recovered through apology or rebranding. Rational actors therefore choose integrity not out of sentiment, but because it maximizes expected utility across future games. There is also a deeper dimension to this logic. Boyd Cohen's Post-Capitalist Entrepreneurship argued that a new form of enterprise is emerging, one that shifts from extraction to generation, from ownership to stewardship. This shift represents an evolution in the underlying assumptions of the economic game. Traditional capitalism treats resources as finite and private. Post-capitalist models treat them as shared and renewable. The rules of the game change when value is created through collaboration rather than competition. In cooperative enterprises, game theory still applies, but the payoff structure differs. The goal is not to outmaneuver others, but to create stable systems where all participants gain. Commons-based peer production, open source innovation, and platform cooperatives all operate on this principle. They rely on transparent rules, shared ownership, and distributed trust. mechanisms that align individual incentives with collective welfare. These are not utopian ideals, but rational responses to complex interdependence. In environments where no single actor can control outcomes, cooperation becomes the equilibrium state. For entrepreneurs building within this framework, the challenge is to design credible systems of participation. Blockchain-based organizations, for example, use smart contracts to make commitments enforceable without centralized authority. Reputation systems in digital communities perform a similar role, turning trust into a quantifiable asset. These mechanisms translate ethical intentions into structural incentives. They make responsible behavior the rational choice by embedding transparency and accountability into the design of the game itself. This evolution in entrepreneurship parallels the maturation of leadership psychology. The early startup culture glorified disruption and risk-taking. Success was measured by speed and valuation. Yet as the field matures, responsible founders recognize that sustainability requires equilibrium, not endless escalation. A company that grows through exploitation of labor, data, or attention eventually destabilizes the ecosystem that sustains it. The post-capitalist entrepreneur sees this not as a moral failure alone, but as a strategic error. Unsustainable practices create negative feedback loops that reduce long-term payoff. By integrating game theory into entrepreneurial reasoning, one can identify these feedback loops before they manifest as crises. For instance, a company that monetizes user engagement through manipulative design may achieve short-term growth but loses user trust over time. The repeated game between company and consumer breaks down. Transparency, consent, and respect for privacy, on the other hand, establish a cooperative equilibrium where users remain willing participants. Ethical design thus becomes a strategic imperative. The same logic applies to investor relations. In the venture capital model, entrepreneurs and investors engage in a classic principal-agent game. The investor, the principal, provides resources but cannot perfectly monitor how the entrepreneur, the agent, uses them. The entrepreneur, in turn, seeks autonomy while maintaining credibility. Misaligned incentives often lead to conflict, pressure for short-term returns versus commitment to long-term mission. The post-capitalist approach seeks to realign this relationship through new financing structures, revenue-sharing models, community investment, or decentralized funding. These models reduce asymmetry by linking returns directly to shared outcomes rather than speculative valuation. At its best, this rethinking of entrepreneurship restores balance between individual ambition and collective well-being. It acknowledges that competition has its place, but must be framed within boundaries that preserve trust. Game theory provides the analytical clarity to define those boundaries. It shows that cooperation is not a concession, but a strategy, one that maximizes stability in systems where relationships matter more than transactions. Understanding the entrepreneur as a player in repeated games also reframes failure. In the traditional view, failure ends the game. In the game theoretic view, failure is simply one round in a longer sequence. What matters is how the player responds, whether they exit, adapt, or rebuild credibility. Founders who treat failure as information rather than defeat can re-enter the next game with stronger strategies. Those who conceal or misrepresent failure damage their reputation and limit future opportunities. The difference lies in transparency and learning. Within teams, this perspective promotes psychological safety. When people know that mistakes will be treated as data rather than punishment, they share information more freely. This openness accelerates learning and innovation. It also creates a cooperative culture that is resilient under stress. Once again, the moral principle aligns with the strategic one. Compassion is efficient because it preserves trust. Responsible coaching and leadership draw directly from this insight. Teaching teams to think in game theoretic terms, to anticipate reactions, understand incentives, and design fair systems equips them to operate autonomously. It replaces micromanagement with strategic empathy, the ability to see the game from others' perspectives. In practice, this means setting clear expectations, making transparent commitments, and rewarding cooperative behavior. Over time, these habits create an organizational equilibrium where integrity is the most profitable strategy. In the broader context, this responsible application of game theory challenges the narrative that business success requires ruthless competition. It demonstrates that rational cooperation, supported by credible commitments, can outperform zero-sum tactics. The task for contemporary entrepreneurs is not to reject competition, but to integrate it with ethical design. They must learn to play complex games in which winning means sustaining the system, not exhausting it. This approach demands intellectual humility. It requires accepting that no single actor can predict or control all outcomes. Instead, the goal is to create adaptive systems that encourage honest signaling and continuous learning. The entrepreneur who understands this does not merely react to the market. They cultivate the conditions for trust to flourish within it. Every organization, no matter its size or mission, operates within a broader social system. The relationships inside a company mirror the relationships outside it. The market, the community, and the cultural context all become part of the game. Understanding these systems means understanding how groups of people coordinate, compete, and evolve. Game theory provides a language for describing this coordination, but to apply it responsibly requires an awareness of psychology, how beliefs, expectations, and norms shape rational behavior. When a company interacts with its environment, it plays not a single game, but a web of overlapping ones. Customers, suppliers, regulators, and communities each respond to the company's actions, forming feedback loops of trust or suspicion. The success of the enterprise depends on maintaining equilibrium among these loops. If one breaks, if customers lose faith, or employees disengage, or regulators intervene, the stability of the entire system is threatened. Responsible entrepreneurship is therefore a systemic discipline. It seeks to align incentives across many levels, not just within the boundaries of ownership. Boyd Cohen's work on post-capitalist entrepreneurship explores this idea directly. He argued that the traditional capitalist game, in which players compete for scarce resources and maximize private gain, has reached the limits of its usefulness. The new economy, shaped by technology and interdependence, requires a different equilibrium. It rewards cooperation, transparency, and purpose because value now emerges from networks rather than from isolated transactions. In this context, the entrepreneur's task shifts from extracting profit to orchestrating participation. Game theory helps explain why this shift is not idealistic but rational. In classical models, cooperation emerges when players expect to interact repeatedly and when mutual benefit outweighs short-term advantage. In modern markets, interactions are constant and visible. Social media, digital platforms, and global supply chains mean that every action is observed and remembered. Reputation circulates faster than capital. Under these conditions, opportunistic behavior becomes more costly, and cooperation becomes a competitive advantage. Cohen described how new organizational forms, cooperatives, social enterprises, benefit corporations, encode this logic structurally. They distribute ownership and decision-making so that individual incentives align with collective goals. This design reduces the principal-agent problem by making every participant both agent and principal. The payoff matrix changes. Success for one member directly increases success for others. In such systems, fairness is not merely ethical, it is efficient. Consider open source communities. They operate without centralized control, yet they produce complex and reliable software that powers much of the digital economy. Contributors act voluntarily, often without direct financial reward, because reputation and reciprocity become their payoffs. The game sustains itself through shared norms rather than formal contracts. From a game theoretic perspective, these communities achieve a cooperative equilibrium where trust replaces enforcement. The mechanism is psychological as much as structural. Participants believe that their contributions will be recognized and that belief sustains continued cooperation. This model offers lessons for traditional enterprises. When employees feel that their contributions are valued and visible, they cooperate more fully. When they believe that the system rewards honesty and initiative, they share information instead of hoarding it. Culture, in this sense, is an informal game structure, a set of shared expectations about how others will behave. Responsible leadership means shaping those expectations consciously. It requires designing feedback systems where doing the right thing is also the most rational thing. Psychology provides the bridge between these theoretical models and real behavior. Humans are social learners. They internalize norms by observing others and adjusting to maintain belonging. In group settings, fairness and reciprocity are powerful motivators, often stronger than monetary reward. This insight, supported by behavioral economics, shows why ethical leadership has measurable strategic value. People will work harder, innovate more, and remain more loyal when they trust that the system treats them justly. Game theory explains this as an equilibrium of expectations. Fairness persists because it is reciprocated, and exploitation collapses because it triggers retaliation. Cohen emphasized that social systems naturally yield to psychological forces. Power, reputation, and trust are not external to strategy. They are its foundation. When leaders misuse these forces, when they manipulate perception, make empty commitments, or withhold information, they may gain short-term compliance but lose long-term legitimacy. In the repeated game of leadership, legitimacy is the only sustainable advantage. It cannot be demanded or purchased. It must be earned through consistent, transparent behavior. The responsible application of game theory thus requires humility about control. In complex systems, outcomes emerge from interactions among many players, not from the dictates of any single one. A company can design incentives, but it cannot dictate trust. It can publish values, but only behavior determines whether those values are believed. The leader's role is to influence the conditions under which cooperation becomes self-reinforcing. This involves careful attention to communication, reward structures, and visible consistency between words and actions. Social systems also illustrate the phenomenon of path dependence. Once a pattern of behavior becomes established, it shapes future expectations. If a company develops a culture of secrecy, even transparent leaders will be met with skepticism until new patterns take hold. If collaboration has historically been punished or ignored, people will default to self-protection. Changing such equilibria requires credible commitments over time, repeated demonstrations that the new rules are real. This is why culture change cannot be achieved through slogans. It requires altering the payoff structure so that cooperation becomes safer and more rewarding than resistance. The post-capitalist entrepreneur recognizes this and builds systems designed for trust from the outset. Instead of relying on authority, they rely on transparency. Instead of commanding loyalty, they invite participation. Governance mechanisms, shared decision platforms, open accounting, community feedback loops serve as institutionalized commitments. They remove ambiguity, making it clear that fairness is not optional. The resulting equilibrium is both more stable and more adaptive because it distributes intelligence across the network. Such distributed systems also mitigate one of capitalism's enduring dilemmas: the concentration of power. When information and decision-making are centralized, those at the top can distort incentives for personal gain. Game theory predicts that this leads to inefficiency and eventual collapse as trust decays and cooperation erodes. Decentralized structures, by contrast, maintain accountability through mutual observation. Each participant becomes both player and referee. Blockchain governance, though still imperfect, attempts to formalize this principle technologically. It transforms trust from a social assumption into a programmable rule. The ethical challenge is to ensure that these systems remain genuinely inclusive. Technology can encode fairness, but it can also amplify inequality if control of the rules remains opaque. Responsible leadership means designing governance that is both transparent and revisable, a living equilibrium that adapts as the community evolves. This reflects a deeper understanding of equilibrium itself, not a static balance, but a dynamic state of continuous adjustment, where trust and competition coexist productively. At the psychological level, responsible game design acknowledges that humans are not purely rational actors. They seek meaning as much as reward. Organizations that provide purpose tap into an intrinsic form of motivation that aligns easily with cooperative equilibria. Purpose functions as a non-material payoff. It transforms work from a transaction into a contribution. When people believe that their efforts matter, coordination becomes effortless. Leaders who understand this create narratives that connect individual action to collective good. These narratives must be honest because once disconfirmed, they cannot be repaired. Authenticity becomes a strategic asset. Cohen's vision of entrepreneurship extends beyond business into civic life. He proposed that entrepreneurial thinking, the willingness to experiment, to take responsibility, to build rather than wait, can rejuvenate social systems. But this form of entrepreneurship is distinct from opportunism. It is grounded in service, not conquest. The entrepreneur becomes a steward of systems rather than an extractor of value. Game theory supports this shift. In ecosystems where long-term survival depends on cooperation, predatory strategies are self-defeating. This understanding has implications for how societies design economic policy. If cooperation yields better collective outcomes, then public institutions should create frameworks that reward transparency and shared benefit. Regulations that enforce disclosure, anti-corruption measures, and stakeholder accountability are not constraints on enterprise, but conditions for fair play. They reduce information asymmetry and stabilize expectations, making markets function more efficiently. Responsible entrepreneurs welcome such frameworks because they protect the integrity of the game. At the organizational level, this translates into internal governance that mirrors democratic principles. When employees have a voice in decision-making, they internalize responsibility for outcomes. When feedback is open and safe, errors are corrected early. These mechanisms transform potential conflicts into opportunities for learning. The game ceases to be zero-sum, it becomes iterative, generative, and self-correcting. The social psychology of cooperation also explains the power of acknowledgement. In repeated interactions, recognition functions as a signal of respect and trust. It strengthens the cooperative equilibrium by confirming that contributions are noticed. Neglect, by contrast, signals indifference, prompting withdrawal. This insight applies as much to teams as to nations. Cooperation depends on mutual visibility. Systems that obscure contribution, whether through bureaucracy or hierarchy, weaken motivation. The post-capitalist approach reframes success as the capacity to sustain these cooperative dynamics across time. A company's value is measured not only in profit, but in the resilience of its relationships. Game theory clarifies that resilience arises from flexibility, the ability to adapt without breaking trust. When leaders make credible commitments but remain open to revision, they create a culture of negotiated stability. People can depend on fairness even as circumstances change. Responsibility, in this light, means foresight. It means anticipating how decisions reverberate through the network of interactions. Every policy has externalities. Every incentive reshapes behavior in ways that may not be immediately visible. The responsible strategist evaluates these second and third order effects before acting. They understand that short-term efficiency can create long-term fragility, just as cooperation deferred today can become conflict tomorrow. At the frontier of entrepreneurship, these principles converge in hybrid organizations, ventures that combine commercial discipline with social purpose. Their founders use market mechanisms to solve public problems, turning competition into a force for collective improvement. They play complex games, balancing profit and purpose, autonomy and accountability. Their success demonstrates that the logic of the market can coexist with the ethics of the commons when designed with care. The next phase of this exploration turns inward again, to leadership and decision-making. Having examined how systems respond to incentives and how cooperation emerges at scale, it is necessary to return to the human center of these systems, the individual leader. The final reflection will address how influence, honesty, and responsible commitment determine whether a game remains fair, and how the ethics of strategic behavior shape the future of organizational trust. Leadership begins where information ends. It occupies the space between certainty and ambiguity, where judgment and integrity must substitute for complete knowledge. In that space, influence becomes the defining skill, the ability to move others toward a shared objective without coercion or deceit. Game theory, when stripped of its abstraction, is ultimately about influence, how to shape the expectations and actions of others through credible signals. But to use it responsibly, leaders must understand the moral gravity of that act. Influence is not the same as manipulation. The difference lies in intent, transparency, and respect for autonomy. And within any organization, leaders operate through repeated interactions. Every instruction, promise, or correction becomes part of a larger game that others learn to interpret. Over time, people stop responding to specific words and begin responding to patterns. They infer whether commitments are reliable, whether fairness is consistent, whether honesty is practiced. A leader who treats influence as a series of tactical moves will eventually be exposed by those patterns. A leader who treats it as a moral practice builds credibility that persists beyond any individual decision. In the language of game theory, credibility is a form of capital. It transforms uncertain promises into believable commitments. Without it, coordination collapses. Employees withhold effort, partners demand guarantees, and negotiations degenerate into defensive posturing. With it, trust accelerates cooperation and lowers the cost of coordination. The rational leader invests in credibility not for image, but for efficiency. It makes future cooperation easier and more resilient. The erosion of credibility often begins with vagueness. Leaders who avoid clarity in order to preserve flexibility unintentionally signal unreliability. Vague commitments, we'll revisit that later. We'll see how it goes. For now, this is the plan. May appear pragmatic, but they create uncertainty about intent. In strategic terms, they widen the range of possible interpretations, forcing others to hedge their behavior. People become cautious, withhold initiative, and interpret every change as betrayal. Resentment grows, not from disagreement, but from the sense that agreements never existed in the first place. Clarity, by contrast, limits the space for misinterpretation. It allows others to plan confidently, even when the news is unfavorable. Responsible leaders therefore err on the side of explicitness. They articulate not only decisions, but reasoning, boundaries, and conditions. This openness creates a predictable environment where disagreement does not threaten trust. When outcomes later change, people can trace the logic and understand why. In game theoretic terms, clarity stabilizes expectations. It turns uncertainty into structured risk. Game theory also explains why honesty about limits and constraints enhances rather than weakens authority. When a leader admits uncertainty, they reduce the asymmetry of information that often breeds suspicion. Followers interpret transparency as evidence of reliability because it shows the leader is not exploiting hidden knowledge for advantage. This dynamic transforms what might appear as vulnerability into credibility. The leader signals that they are playing a cooperative rather than adversarial game. The challenge arises when honesty conflicts with short-term interest. Many organizations reward leaders for optimism, confidence, and persuasive certainty. Yet in repeated games, excessive optimism functions like inflation. It devalues future promises. Each unfulfilled projection makes the next one harder to believe. Over time, the organization becomes trapped in a cycle of disbelief, where even sincere commitments are discounted. Breaking that cycle requires what might be called strategic modesty, the discipline to promise less than one hopes to deliver and to treat truth as an asset, not a constraint. Responsibility in leadership also involves restraint in the use of psychological tactics. Game theory can be applied to motivate, persuade, and even outmaneuver others, but its ethical use depends on reciprocity. When influence becomes one-sided, when the goal is to extract compliance rather than cultivate understanding, the leader moves from strategy to exploitation. In the short term, manipulation can be effective. People respond to pressure, incentives, and emotional cues. But in the repeated game of organizational life, manipulation breeds cynicism. Once people realize they have been played, they adapt by disengaging or retaliating. Responsible influence, therefore, requires empathy, the ability to see how one's actions will be interpreted from the other side of the game. Empathy does not mean leniency. It means understanding the perception of fairness. A decision that is tough but consistent can sustain trust. A decision that is convenient but hypocritical destroys it. Leaders who understand this design incentive systems that feel fair, even when they demand sacrifice. They make explicit how trade-offs are distributed and why. The sense of procedural fairness becomes a stabilizing force, allowing difficult choices to be accepted without rebellion. At a structural level, the responsible use of game theory means creating systems where honesty and cooperation are not heroic acts, but default behaviors. This involves designing reward mechanisms that align personal benefit with collective good. For example, shared metrics across departments encourage cross-functional collaboration. Transparent performance data reduces the temptation to distort results. When these mechanisms are in place, integrity becomes rational. People act ethically not only because they wish to, but because the system rewards it. The opposite configuration, one that rewards appearance over substance, competition over coordination, inevitably leads to distortion. Employees adapt rationally to the signals they receive. If success depends on pleasing superiors rather than achieving outcomes, people will prioritize perception. If rewards depend on short-term performance, long-term thinking will vanish. These are not moral failings. They are predictable consequences of misaligned incentives. Responsible leaders confront this reality by examining how each rule and metric shapes behavior, then adjusting until the desired equilibrium emerges. Extreme ownership and accountability, ideas popularized in modern management culture, align closely with this principle. They establish a clear connection between action and consequence, making responsibility visible. When leaders publicly accept the outcomes of their decisions, good or bad, they demonstrate credible commitment. This gesture reinforces a cooperative equilibrium. Others are more willing to take responsibility when they see it modeled at the top. Conversely, when leaders deflect blame, they teach avoidance. Responsibility, like trust, cascades through imitation. Another dimension of ethical influence involves how leaders use information asymmetry. Access to privileged information is an inherent part of hierarchy. The question is whether it is used to protect or to exploit. In cooperative systems, information is shared as widely as possible to align understanding. In exploitative systems, it is hoarded to maintain control. Game theory predicts that transparency, though sometimes risky, improves group performance by enabling better coordination. The cost of occasional misuse is outweighed by the collective gains from informed decision-making. Responsible leaders share information not as a favor, but as a strategy for stability. The same logic applies to feedback. In hierarchical organizations, feedback often flows upward selectively and downward bluntly. This imbalance distorts perception and encourages risk aversion. A leader who wishes to maintain credibility must invert this pattern. Invite dissent, tolerate bad news, and respond to criticism without retaliation. This behavior signals that the game is fair. Players can speak truth without penalty. When that condition holds, innovation thrives because new ideas are no longer filtered through fear. The broader implication is that integrity and adaptability are not opposing qualities, but complementary ones. A rigid adherence to principle can be as destructive as opportunism if it prevents learning. The art of leadership lies in distinguishing between values that must remain fixed and strategies that must evolve. Game theory provides a tool for this discernment. Values form the rules of the game. Strategies are the moves within those rules. Changing the rules without consent breaks trust. Changing the moves within agreed rules demonstrates agility. Responsible leaders also recognize the limits of rational calculation. Not every human interaction can be reduced to payoffs and probabilities. Loyalty, compassion, and moral conviction often motivate behavior in ways that transcend material incentives. A complete theory of management must account for these dimensions not as anomalies, but as integral features of human systems. Leaders who appeal only to logic neglect the emotional substrate of cooperation. The most efficient equilibrium is not purely economic, it is psychological, built on belonging and respect. At the same time, emotional intelligence must not become manipulation. The difference again lies in intent. Emotional awareness used to foster understanding builds trust. Emotional awareness used to engineer compliance undermines it. In organizations, this distinction often shows in how empathy is practiced. Genuine empathy listens. Performative empathy persuades. The first strengthens relationships, the second exhausts them. Over time, people learn which one they are receiving. In the post-capitalist framework described by Cohen, leadership must evolve alongside economic systems. The centralized, command-based model suited to industrial capitalism cannot sustain creativity or moral coherence in interconnected networks. Instead, leadership becomes facilitation, creating environments where individuals self-coordinate around shared purpose. The leader's influence shifts from issuing directives to curating trust. Game theory still applies, but the game itself is redesigned, from dominance to stewardship, from extraction to regeneration. This evolution carries profound ethical consequences. The more power a leader has to influence beliefs and behavior, the greater their obligation to use that power transparently. When influence is hidden, when motives are disguised behind strategy, manipulation masquerades as wisdom. The responsible leader makes influence visible. They explain not only what they are doing, but why. They treat followers as participants in a shared reasoning process, capable of understanding trade-offs. This openness transforms hierarchy into collaboration. Transparency also serves as protection against the corrosive effects of success. Power isolates. It filters information and insulates leaders from the feedback loops that once kept them honest. Game theory predicts this phenomenon. As the cost of dishonesty decreases for those at the top, the temptation to distort reality increases. Responsible systems counteract this by embedding transparency into structure, independent audits, shared governance, and distributed accountability. The goal is not to mistrust leaders, but to safeguard them from the self-deception that power invites. The responsible use of strategy also demands restraint in competition. Rivalry can sharpen performance, but unchecked, it breeds hostility that damages the ecosystem all participants depend on. Leaders must recognize when competitive tactics risk destroying mutual value. Price wars, predatory hiring, and zero-sum negotiations may yield temporary wins, but erode the relational infrastructure that sustains industries. Cooperation among competitors, through shared standards, ethical agreements, and collective problem-solving, can create a higher equilibrium where innovation flourishes without exploitation. Ultimately, the ethics of influence converge on one principle: integrity as alignment. Words, actions, and intentions must reinforce one another. When they do, credibility accumulates like interest. When they diverge, it evaporates instantly. The leader's most valuable asset is this alignment, not charisma or cleverness. It cannot be faked because it is continually tested in the micro interactions of daily work. Every email, meeting, and decision contributes evidence. Over time, people form a probabilistic model of the leader's reliability, much as players in a game infer strategies from past moves. Responsible leadership ensures that model converges toward predictability, grounded in honesty. As organizations grow, the challenge becomes institutionalizing this integrity so that it survives beyond individual personalities. Codes of conduct, transparent decision processes, and collective accountability transform ethics from aspiration into architecture. When people can rely on systems rather than on personal virtue alone, trust scales. In such environments, influence becomes less about persuasion and more about coordination. The leader's voice matters not because it commands, but because it clarifies. The modern world demands this kind of leadership. Complexity, interdependence, and visibility have made manipulation less sustainable and honesty more strategic. The long-term payoff of integrity exceeds the short-term gains of deceit. Game theory, when understood deeply, affirms this conclusion. The most stable equilibrium is one in which cooperation, fairness, and credible commitment prevail. These are not sentimental ideals, but mathematically durable strategies in repeated games. To build companies responsibly is to act from that understanding. It is to design systems that reward honesty, to cultivate cultures that interpret transparency as strength, and to teach influence as stewardship rather than control. It is to acknowledge that every organization is a living network of reciprocal games, played by people whose dignity must be preserved if the game is to continue. When leaders internalize this view, strategy and ethics cease to be separate disciplines. They become the same practice expressed at different levels of awareness. Every decision becomes an act of design, a small adjustment to the rules of cooperation that determine whether trust expands or contracts. The measure of leadership, then, is not how many games one wins, but how many players choose to keep playing. That is the quiet power of responsible game theory and management. It replaces the pursuit of victory with the cultivation of continuity. It teaches that the most intelligent strategy is not to dominate, but to sustain, to create conditions where everyone has reason to act with integrity because integrity has become the most rational move.